Welcome, everybody. I'm Jim Hamilton, professor of economics at UCSD, and it's a great pleasure to see you all in person here. So the little faces on the screen that we've been doing for the past couple of years. And we're also very thrilled to have the Department of Urban Studies and Planning team up with the economics department now to bring this series to you. And welcome also to those of you following us on Zoom and those of you watching this later on YouTube. We got a really thought-provoking presentation today that I'll tell you about in just a moment. But before I introduce today's speaker, let me let you know what we have in store for the rest of the year. Emergence of China as a major world power has been one of the main stories of the last couple decades. And I don't know how I can stop these things from popping up. But India is soon set to become the most populous country in the world. And what's the potential for India? What's going to happen with India? Fortunately, we have one of the world's experts on that topic right at UCSD. Well, actually, right at the moment, he's in India, but he'll be back for the April 25th roundtable. And we'll meet at 7:30 a.m. for that one in the UCSD Faculty Club. Later on in the year, actually, whether you're talking about the economy or the market or housing, all our eyes are on what the Federal Reserve is going to do. And we have the perfect person to talk about that. This will be an online event for July 10th. Loretta Mester is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And in that role, she is one of the people who decides what's going to happen to interest rates. Maybe you saw her quoted in the Wall Street Journal last week saying she thought the Fed hadn't been raising interest rates fast enough or far enough. And so that may be a news-making event when she comes to tells us this summer where she thinks monetary policy should go and what kind of effect it's having. And then for the fall, we maybe have our crowning event for the year. If you took macroeconomics at UCSD, I know you heard about the Taylor rule for evaluating monetary policy. Stanford professor John Taylor is one of America's most prominent macroeconomists. And I'm so happy that we persuaded him to visit the campus in person. That'll be October 6th. That'll be held at 7:30 in the morning at the Faculty Club. So we've got a great season in store. And if you have any suggestions for topics or speakers you'd like to hear for 2024 or feedback on logistics or any aspect of what we're doing, please pass them along to me or one of the other members of the steering committee, which is Isaac Martin, Manny Labrinos, Melissa McGrain, Joe Marshall, Terry Moore, Alan Nevin, Alex Rojas, Don Billings, and Jeff Lewin. Let me also take this opportunity to thank, again, our co-sponsor, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and our corporate sponsor, the CFA Society, and our other sponsors, Terry Moore, Sullivan Hill, and Alex Rojas. And now for today's event. Did you know that San Diego has been losing population? And today, there are fewer people living in San Diego than there were 6 years ago. And there are fewer people living in Los Angeles today than there were 10 years ago. So is that something we should be concerned about? And if so, what should we do about it? That's going to be one of our topics today from Professor Lee Ohanian. Lee is a distinguished professor of economics at UCLA. That's not a word I make up to make him sound important. That's his official title that UCLA makes up to make him sound important. Anyway, he is distinguished professor of economics at UCLA and also is the director of the Edinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at UCLA. He's published widely in the leading economics journals, been an advisor to several different Federal Reserve banks and foreign central banks. His research you may have seen discussed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, many other outlets. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Rochester. Please join me in welcoming Lee Ohanian.
Good morning, everyone. Jim, thanks so much for the warm introduction and making me sound important. It's a treat to join you today and be part of the UCSD Economics Roundtable. UCSD is truly a remarkable is truly a remarkable university with a fantastic economics department. So I'm delighted to be here and share ideas with you about what's been happening in California. And Jim mentioned the fact that people are leaving. The state's lost about 500,000 on net since 2020. It's a very substantial loss. And so I'll show you some of my observations about why this has happened, and then some ideas about what we can do to reverse course. Do I, let's see. Oh, okay, thank you. I think I failed the IQ test. Okay, so in terms of the theme, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare two periods in the history of California. One is from about the 1950s to the 1970s, where we had very rapid growth, rapid economic growth, rapid population growth, relatively small government, and one that was a very, very focused and efficient government. And then I'll talk about California after that time. After the 1970s, we had slower economic growth, slower population growth, much larger government budgets. So what I'm going to argue is a less focused and less efficient government. And we're going to see large differences in efficiency and accountability and priorities between these two periods. And I'm going to talk about the road to restoring what we used to call the California dream. What I grew up with here as a kid, grew up in California in the 1960s and 1970s, when it seemed like anything and everything was possible. And I think today we still have this, remarkably beautiful state with enormous opportunities, but it's one that I think in which that California dream has slipped away. And I'm going to tie this to what I see as a lot of common sense changes we can make within government to deal with inefficiencies, organizational failures. I'll talk about some of those, costly regulations. As economists, we think about regulations as being in place to protect people for different types of reasons, but we now see regulations in place that kind of protect politically important groups and aren't necessarily working as maybe the way we would like them to. And government prioritizing issues that at one time back in the day would not have been so important, and government today not prioritizing the issues that I think we really want them to prioritize. And so I'm going to make the case that failed governance is a big part of what happened in California and why we've lost that dream. So why has government, and I'll talk about lack of efficiency, some dysfunctionality as quality of governance. So why has that declined? So I'm going to tie this to a lack of accountability. Reflecting what I see as really a sea change within the culture of government of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s versus more recent California governments. And further, I'm going to further connect that with the lack of incentives within government. And third, we used to have remarkably functional, effective public-private partnership during the time that California tripled in size in roughly 30 years. So between 1940 and early 1970s, California grew from 7 million to 20 million people. Okay, just imagine that. And we'll talk about how they were able to pull that off and how government was so functionally effective in helping make that happen and really becoming a very productive partner with the private sector. And then I'll talk about some nonpartisan ideas to help restore the dream. I really want to emphasize nonpartisanship here from the standpoint that accountability, incentives, efficiency, functionality, these aren't, right or left or blue or red issues. These are really kind of what we would call common sense economics issues. So let me begin. I'm going to take you back in time just to set the stage for the remarkable dream that became California. So I'm going to go all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. 1900, California just had 2.5 million people. I'm sorry, 2 million people. It was just 2.5% of the United States. California was at that time was a sleepy backwater. Mining and finance in Northern California around San Francisco and the Sierras, and then a little bit in Los Angeles, and that was pretty much California. Mississippi was bigger. Ohio was 4 times bigger. The city of Chicago in 1900 was 1.87 million, nearly as large as California. By 1970, California became 20 million people, nearly 10% of the United States population. And if California had grown at the national average between 1900 and 1970, instead of 20 million people, California would have just a little bit over 5 million people. So California was a place where where everybody wanted to be, and so many people came. Now, with just this massive surge of people coming to California, the issue that comes on state and local government is how do we manage that growth? And what made it even more challenging is that from a demographic point of view, this was a very young population. 50% of the state's population was under 24 years old, meaning relatively few taxpayers. And not only just relatively few taxpayers, but these young people needed schools and they needed colleges. And we had a budget in the early 1960s when the growth was at its highest that was just on a per capita basis and adjusted for inflation. The state budget was just 13% of what it is today on a per person inflation adjusted basis. And yet, despite with that little tiny budget, California policymakers figured out a way to accommodate all these people rushing in. And they needed schools and hospitals, and they needed water and roads and utilities, and they need colleges. And you have this laundry list of things that, okay, hey, and my in-laws are here this morning. Please give them a welcome when you get a chance. And so, it's like, hey, the in-laws are coming. I visited them. They didn't visit me. Hey, the in-laws are coming. We better stock up the fridge and we better get some extra beds. This was California. A rush of people was coming in. So what did they do? Well, they figured out a way to make that happen on just 13% of today's budget. So how did they pull that off during this period of tripling the population, just a 30-year period? Well, spending was very focused on priorities, and the government was incredibly efficient and was able to get things done at a very low cost. And there was a real focus on capital spending. During the 1960s, when a fellow named Pat Brown was governor, for those of you who are not my age, you will have, for those who may be very young, you may not have heard of him, but you've heard of his son, Jerry Brown, who was governor for us twice. And spending was 25% of the budget. That is enormous. I'll talk about today's budget. It's only about 4%, only about 4% of today's budget. And there is a recognition that with all these people coming in, we need to have these capital spending projects. We needed schools and hospitals. We needed roads and utilities. We need to create new towns and cities. And government was remarkably effective and functional and partnering with the private sector to make this happen. And what I did is I actually went back to the budgets, the state budgets of the 1960s. And every governor has a budget statement. And so I read those budget statements from Pat Brown, and I've reproduced some of the quotes here. I think these really summarize what the culture was in government at that time, what the social norm was, that people were coming to California, and we're going to welcome them, and we're going to make sure that the infrastructure is in place for them to be able to succeed. And they're going to gain from being here, and we're going to gain from having them here. So you need some of these quotes. We must invest to accommodate, he called it magnificent growth. Our priority is to protect and invest. And we can't abuse taxpayers. We must use their precious tax dollars wisely. And he also made this point, and so those of you in the finance industry and economists will appreciate this. He said the return on our public investments must at least be as high as on our private investments. And this was the mindset of California government in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And it was a remarkable accomplishment to have a population triple in such a short period of time and have that occur in such a remarkable fashion. So during this period of remarkable population growth, California became a leading center for finance and aerospace, entertainment, energy, tourism services. We had the best public K-12 system back in the day. We had remarkable public universities. We still do, and we have the pleasure of being here at a truly remarkable university. And as much as we are challenged today with water issues, back in the day, we had frontier efficiency water, water storage, water drainage. We had some of the best roads and highways in the country. We had tremendous electrical infrastructure and housing during a period of booming growth, where if anything, you would think, well, there's only so many houses. If we have a lot more people come into this room, we only have so many houses. The price of a house is going to go up. We built houses very, very quickly. And California has always been more expensive, at least as far back as our housing price statistics go. It's always been more expensive than national average, about 35%. But that 35% premium didn't go up, not until more recently. Today, we have about 118% premium. And for those of you like me with kids, and I think about, well, how are my kids going to be able to afford to live in California? I mean, you just end up shaking your head. We'll talk about, the median price now in a California home is around $700,000. Now, that was the California then. That was as a kid, that was the California I grew up with, where, with my friends and I, we used to think that this is the place to be. Everybody wants to be here. Anything's possible. Well, instead of that tripling of a population over a couple of decades, we've seen 500,000 people on net leave California since 2020. And interestingly enough, every decade, the California Finance Department makes a demographic forecast for 10 years out for how many people will be in the state 10 years hence. And in 2010, the Finance Department made a forecast. They were off by a million people for 2020. They were off by 1 million people, and they'd never. And I went back and I looked at their previous projections for previous decades, made 10 years before, and all of those were within a couple 100,000, and they always undershot. So this was the first time that they overshot, and they overshot by 1 million people. We're spending a ton. Within government, state government, we're spending a ton. Our inflation adjusted per person state budget is about 7.5 times higher than the 1960s, but there's basic functions that just aren't getting done. And I think among the most important functions that aren't getting done are the capital investments that really characterized the California government back in the day. Today, capital spending is only about 4% of the state budget, and that doesn't cover depreciation. And we'll talk about roads and bridges and public schools that need updating. And when you drive around the state and you see this repair, that's the reason why we're not spending enough on investment. We can't even cover depreciation. And the lack of investment and our failure to make these capital spending plans, this is having enormous effects on us. And I think, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why our quality of life is not nearly as high as it could be, and was pushing some people out of the state. So the Society of Civil Engineers, every 2 years, they grade states on their infrastructure, including roads and dams and levees and water drainage. And we get a D+. So for the professors in here, we don't like to give Ds, and I don't think the Society of Civil Engineers does either, but we get a D+. And within those reports, and you can find them online, 1,680 dams are considered to be in risky condition. 70% are over 50 years old. And that's right about the lifespan of these dams. 1 out of 18 bridges is structurally deficient. And, after I found this information out, I mean, when I go over a bridge now, I just kind of, keep my fingers crossed and pray to St. Jude. I make it over. 50% of our bridges have now exceeded their lifespan, their functional lifespan determined by engineers. And this includes bridges on high traffic routes, such as the I-5, the I-80, and the 101. Believe it or not, we have fewer miles of usable roads today in California than we did 30 years ago. And the poor quality of our roads and the lack of, and our inability to add capacity costs drivers $61 billion per year over the national average. $61 billion per year. That is about a fifth of this year's state budget. Commuters burn nearly 300 million gallons of gasoline sitting in traffic. And again, when you think about all the efforts the state makes to combat carbon emissions, this is an obvious push in the wrong direction. We're 49th in the country in terms of road quality, despite the fact that we have the second highest state gasoline taxes, which are supposed to be maintaining and fixing our roads. And, this made me think about, and I'm going to keep coming back to Pat Brown, Democratic governor, who I believe for 2 terms in the 1960s, who said, our priority is to invest. We can't abuse taxpayers. We have to use their tax dollars wisely. So this is really a juxtaposition between what government stood for and what we're seeing now. How about water storage? Well, we've had, at least where I live up in Santa Barbara, we had just an enormous rains in January, and I suspect those came down here too. But as you know, if you lived in California for a period of time, California is subject to semi-regular drought. And we go through periods where there's water rationing and there's challenges in making sure that the ag sector gets water for their crops. Well, in 2017, the Oroville Dam, which is one of our major reservoirs, failed. And that dam was built in 1968. 188,000 people had to be evacuated. Now, back in 2005, it was identified for retrofitting. Okay, the dam is close to the end of its life. And a couple of years later, cracks in the dam were discovered. Still, it was not fixed. Well, the dam failed in 2017. It cost $1.1 billion to fix that dam. And that $1.1 billion does not include the economic costs and other indirect costs associated with that. The retrofit would have been around $60 million. Okay, so when we see this kind of comparison, again, we ask, well, why wasn't this investment made? Why weren't we watching out for this? I think back in the day, back with the culture of government in the 1960s, I don't think this would have happened. This dam would have been fixed because that was the common sense thing to do. Now this event comes close to home for me because there were mudslides in Santa Barbara in 2018. Very sad. 23 of my neighbors perished. It was only over $500 million in damages. And the mudslide came down from mountains, and there are debris flow basins that are intended to capture those boulders and mud. And those debris flow basins have not been cleared out for decades, and their capture capacity declined by 60%. That was noted in 2005. And still they weren't cleaned out. Why? Well, a budget wasn't put in for them, and there was a threat of environmental lawsuits if that was done. The Army Corps of Engineers warned about loss of life and the lack of adequate maintenance. And again, this is a case where back in the 1960s, that government, that culture, that emphasis on capital spending, that emphasis, what really matters to people, we want to be safe, this wouldn't have happened. In our recent storms, 17 people have died. The estimate is $30 to $34 billion in damages from the flooding that occurred in January. A lot of this is coming from inadequate storm drainage, just as what my family and I lived through in Santa Barbara. Now, a lot of California storm drainage was built in the 40s or before. And now Los Angeles' system was built in 1915. Now, at that time, it was considered frontier technology. Our storm drainage is graded by the Civil Engineers Society as a D+. I think they were I think they were being gracious to us by giving us that D+, given that we haven't really invested in this for over 80 years. And again, you're asked, well, why? This is such an important issue. Why haven't we made these investments? Now, the flip side of this is the water we provide to us as residential customers, to agricultural businesses, to non-ag businesses for environmental purposes. We are not making investments in water conveyance. Many water pipes in the state are 60 years old or older. For these pipes, lifespan is typically considered to be 50 years. I teach at UCLA, and a few years ago, a large water pipe that was cast iron, so it's about 50 years old. Somehow it made it to 100 years. It was 100 years old. It burst, and over 250 gallons of water flooded Westwood, flooded the UCLA campus. If you've ever been to a basketball game, a Poly Pavilion, famous basketball venue, that was flooded. Why wasn't a 100-year-old pipe replaced? And then at a more macro level, we haven't had any major water investments since 1973. This was, in fact, recognized by Senator Feinstein a couple of years ago. And it's not as if, as voters, we keep telling politicians we want investment in water. Since 1996, we've approved, as voters, $27 billion in bond funds for new water projects. Almost all of that funding hasn't even been spent. It's just sitting there. It's been appropriated, but it hasn't been spent. You know, California suffers when it rains, and California suffers when it doesn't rain. Why haven't we made those investments? I reproduced the quote from Senator Feinstein, who said, we have the same water infrastructure as when the population was 16 million. Well, probably close to about 22 million, but still, we have the same water infrastructure when the state was roughly half as large as it is today. And what was put in place with what was known as the California Water Project, which was designed in the late 1950s, again, policymakers said, we've got these people coming here, we've got to figure out water. And they came up with a remarkable plan. It just hasn't been updated in 50 years. And again, you know, the question I'd like you to ask yourself is, why aren't we making these investments? Another issue where we haven't made investments is wildfires. 9 of the 10 largest wildfires in California have occurred since 2012. The Camp Fire, which was last year, alone reflects nearly $500 billion in losses. Just think about that. Over 2 state budgets are associated with the economic losses from the Camp Fire. That's just one. That was just one fire. We now have, partially because of very expensive housing, we have people moving further away where land is more affordable. We now have 2 million properties that are at risk of wildfire. And sadly, why has this happened? Well, we haven't conducted fire breaks. We haven't implemented fire breaks. We haven't conducted prescribed burns. We haven't thinned out forests. We haven't made those investments to reduce the risk of wildfire. And what struck me as just so sad, and as an as a person, so sad, as an economist, even sadder, the state has spent enormously on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the wildfires that have occurred since 2005, the greenhouse gas emissions from those wildfires alone have offset everything we've done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through electric cars and all the other ways we have tried to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those have been completely offset by wildfires. And that doesn't even include the health damages that come from particulate emissions that come from those fires. Particulate emissions being different than greenhouse gas emissions. So this is obviously a priority for us. Why wasn't this dealt with? And again, this is not a partisan issue. We've had Republican governors and Democratic governors. Now, obviously, the state is highly Democrat, but there's not a partisan issue here. This is just common sense economics. Voters need to be protected from wildfires. We live in our population centers are relatively concentrated. We have lots and lots of forest. We need to have done much better jobs. And yet, year after year, we keep seeing these enormous fires. Having lived in Los Angeles for a long time, I found this statistic is somewhat painful, no pun intended. 4,600 miles of Los Angeles sidewalks are broken to the point they're identified as an injury risk. And every year, there's roughly 400 or more, this statistic is a little bit old, personal injury lawsuits that are filed by citizens who are walking along these sidewalks and trip and fall. And again, you just think, hey, it's a priority to fix a sidewalk that has a sinkhole in it. Why aren't these getting done? And again, I harken back to Pat Brown's quotes. Government's priority is to protect and invest. The basics aren't getting done. And it's not just our sidewalks and roads and bridges and levees and water drainage, it's our public services. Okay, so during COVID, we had, there was a huge increase in unemployment because we shut down a lot of the economy. What happened? Well, the state's employment department has a 40-year-old IT system, and it runs on a language. Sadly, I'm old enough to know what this means, but there's an early computer language was called COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language. It was developed in the 1950s. So we have 40-year-old computers running a language that's 70 years old. Well, the system crashed. It couldn't keep up with all the claims that were being filed. 1.5 million legitimate unemployment claims were delayed for months. 32.6 billion was paid in fraudulent claims that weren't flagged. Fraudulent claims paid to convicted felons in state prisons, paid to someone masquerading as Senator Dianne Feinstein. As many as 60 different checks were going to one address. None of this was identified. So there's $32 billion of our tax dollars. About, in a normal year, that's about 1/7 of the state budget that were paid because we had a dysfunctional IT system. And so I'll make a comparison here with the private sector, because you don't find a successful private company running a 40-year-old IT system and a 70-year-old computer operating language. And we know why that is, because in the private sector, there's competition. You're fighting for the customer. You've got to be efficient. You've got to be as good as the competition or better if you're going to survive. And, in government, there's not competition. And there are lessons we can learn and implement from the private sector that used to be part of the culture of California government back in the day, when it was de rigueur, it was just assumed, we're not going to waste taxpayer dollars. We're going to be efficient. We're going to be accountable. We've got to get this done. That was the culture. That culture is gone. And to bring it back, we need to bring in accountability and incentives. The person who was running the education department had been there for over 37 years. In the private sector, there's always a race to find the best talent to run the organization. In state government, people tend to work their way up, and there's a chance they might be extremely good at what they do, but there's certainly no guarantee of that, and there's no market incentives or mechanisms to make sure that happens. So accountability and incentives are critical to make sure these types of events don't happen anymore. How about housing? So, you're living in San Diego. It's a high-priced area. You all know that. Not as bad as some areas, such as San Francisco. A big reason why it's so expensive. And remember, the housing price premium was only 35% back in the day, despite that flood of people coming into the state. Well, California is 49th in construction and affordability. Hawaii is a little bit of a one-off. Hawaii is the only one that beats us. And here's an interesting statistic. San Francisco and Silicon Valley as a region have the state's highest incomes, but only 18% of San Francisco and Silicon Valley households can afford the median price home in those areas, compared to about 2/3 of households who can afford the median price home in the rest of the country. Okay, why aren't we building enough? We used to build a lot. We built so much that we could accommodate that tripling of the population without any increase in the price of a California home relative to the rest of the country. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to have been born at a time when I and the cohort I was brought into could achieve the California dream. But today I look at young people and I look at young people, I feel sorry for them because they're going to have to really struggle to attain what I was able to obtain. And what I was able to obtain was made possible by an incredibly functional government. California living costs are 45% higher than the national average. We have very high electricity costs, natural gas prices, gasoline prices. A sobering statistic is roughly 1/3 of us live in poverty or near poverty. 13 million Californians are on Medi-Cal, California's version of Medicaid. If that collection of people was a state, they would be the 5th largest state in the country. And to give you an idea of what it takes to qualify for Medicaid, well, in California, it's a household, the average size household in California is 3. So I did this calculation for family of 3. To qualify for Medicaid, you have to be under $41,000 of income per year for a family of 3. Okay, so just think about living in the state for a family of 3 for under $41,000. And there's about 13 million of us that do that. We can do better. We should and we can do better. In a state that is home to remarkable companies such as Apple and Google and the visionaries who created those businesses, there are an awful lot of people who are struggling, and we're not making it very easy for them. We could make it a lot easier for them if we have some common sense changes within government. So how do we lose our way? Well, the culture's changed. And I'm going to go through this material. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Really began around the 60s and 70s and really took hold in the 80s. There was large political and social and cultural movements in the country around this time. And there was the birth of the environmental movement. And in my opinion, I think we as a society didn't address environmental damages soon enough. I remember as a kid, the Santa Barbara oil spill that made world headlines. It was from an oil spill in the Santa Barbara Bay, and that really was kind of a defining moment for this. So I think we made a mistake not investing in preventing environmental damage. But since that time, the environmental movement, in my opinion, became politicized, and it now dominates a lot of what we can and can't do in the state. And ironically, I think we're losing out on a lot of environmental protection, such as the floods we're seeing that are occurring because of inadequate water drainage, the wildfires we're seeing because of inadequate investments in fire protection. So I'm going to suggest that we can make some sensible reforms to environmental policy, and we can do even better in protecting the environment if we make those changes. A lot of this goes to a single law called the California Environmental Quality Act. It was remarkably well-intentioned. It was put in place right around the time when that Santa Barbara oil spill hit national headlines, world headlines. There was enormous pressure in the state to enact legislation, and we did in 1970. It was signed into law by Ronald Reagan, who was governor then. And the law wasn't very well written, in my opinion. The law says we adopt all feasible measures to mitigate environmental impacts of development. Well, development is going to have environmental impact, no matter what. And, among the economists here, you are automatically going to jump on this and say, well, wait a minute. Feasible doesn't mean practical or in the best interests of society. So CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, we call that CEQA, is inconsistent with the central principle of economics, which is we face trade-offs. And over time, we gradually abandon fiscal responsibility in an efficient public sector. I talked about housing and how the housing price premium used to be 30%, 35%. Well, shortly after CEQA was passed, it became incredibly difficult to build. And by 1980, we had 35% premium year in, year out. By 1980, that premium was up to 80% and has continued to rise. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to skip over some. These are relatively depressing statistics about how expensive California housing has become. You can see some of these. 10 of the 11 most expensive housing metro areas in the country. And we have a $716,000 median single-family home price compared to $328,000 in the rest of the country. 118% price premium. It used to be 35%. I'll give you a quick idea of just how much CEQA and other policies have impacted California housing. In 1994, developers submitted a plan for a new community. 60,000 people in a place that was going to be called Newhall Ranch, if you know where Valencia is. It was near Valencia. Plans were submitted in 1994, 25 years to resolve all lawsuits. Almost all of them were based on CEQA. What finally got approved was a substantially scaled back community, about half the size. And 30 years later, maybe we'll have the first homes occupied 30 years later. Okay, so just think about that. 30 years to get maybe get a home built. And the state is focused on building affordable housing. Well, affordable housing is not so affordable to build. To give you an example, a motel in Santa Clara County was purchased by the county. One of these extended stay motels. It's not the Ritz or the Four Seasons. It's one of, there's a little sitting area, there's a little kitchen, and there's a bedroom. Well, it was converted. It's going to be converted into apartments. And somehow it's going to cost $15 million to add a communal kitchen, laundry facilities, and some outdoor recreation. So think about what you should be able to build for $15 million. Kitchen, laundry facilities, and a playground. Doesn't something seem wrong with that? If there's any developers here? Well, that's what we're spending, and nobody in government seems to be questioning about that. Why is that? It's not just Santa Clara County. Palo Alto is preserving a mobile home park right in the middle of Palo Alto. It's at a cost of over $700,000 per mobile home space. LA is building affordable housing at $837,000 per unit. And the one that really tops this off is that San Francisco is spending $1 million just to renovate apartment units. And so I have, are they putting in platinum faucets in the bathroom? How can you spend $1 million to renovate an apartment unit? This is not affordable housing. Where is the discipline? Where's the accountability? Why aren't people in government saying this? Stop the insanity. We have the 5th highest tax burden, personal tax burden, the 3rd highest business tax burden. We have an enormous state budget. Why aren't we getting more from that? Businesses are leaving. Here's some of them: Hewlett-Packard, Tesla, Charles Schwab, Oracle, CB Richard Ellis. Those are businesses that have left just in the last couple of years. Many of them are going to states with much lower cost of living, much lower taxes: Texas, Florida, Nevada, Tennessee. Routinely, the Tax Foundation, which is a nonpartisan think tank in DC, they rank us as 48th in tax rates. There's economic freedom rankings that puts us near the bottom. When CEOs are asked about where they find it easiest and most cost effective to do business, California is nearly at the bottom. Why aren't our elected officials addressing these issues? I have a few slides on California high-speed rail to illustrate how investment has gone sideways. I'll just say one thing about this to save time. We voters in 2008 approved a bond, $10 billion, to build a $34 billion high-speed rail, 220-mile-an-hour train system that would connect north to south and the valleys to the coasts. Well, what's happened to that? And that was going to be done 5 years ago. $34 billion connecting the state 5 years ago for $33 billion. Well, what's going to get built, maybe, is Bakersfield to Merced for $33 billion, maybe in 2033, maybe. Where's the respect for the taxpayer? Where's the accountability? Under Pat Brown and the legislators he worked with and the people in state government who worked with him at that time, this wouldn't have happened. Restoring the dream. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so let me give you a few ideas. I don't think a magic wand is needed, because if you look at the state, there's 39 million people and all the things that are going on, and you might throw up your hands and say, well, what can we do? I don't think a magic wand is needed. It's really to return to the government we had under Pat Brown. Accountability, a culture of innovation, and making sure that we do things functionally and efficiently and effectively. And how do we get that to be done? Well, there's got to be accountability, and we've got to incentivize efficiency. And in my opinion, I think we can make the investments we need to make to support economic growth and do a better job of protecting the environment. In terms of housing, we've got to reform CEQA. And that's not just me saying that. Pretty much everybody, whether it's the developer, whether it's attorneys, whether people living in cities, everybody has been clamoring for this. I really hope it hasn't been done. I really hope it does as well. And there's some other policies that are less well known. Maybe I'll talk about these during the Q&A, but these are just as important as CEQA. 2/3 of our state budget goes to 3 functional components: K through 12, health and human services, and the prison system. None of them are performing particularly well. Only 1 out of 3 California kids is a grade level in English language arts or math. That's just unacceptable. We're spending twice as much per student as we did a few years ago. Let me go to education first. Let's see. Sorry, I'm going, let's see, I'm sorry, I think I'm going sideways. Sorry, backwards, okay. I'm really going to focus on K through 12 because we want to make sure our kids have the same opportunities that we've had. We used to have, I mean, when I was a kid growing up, we had the best school system in the country. Now, 44th in math, 38th in reading, only 1 out of 3 kids are competent. And in particular, those statistics are even worse in low-income neighborhoods and among families at risk. And, you know, a lot of people, whether it's left or right, a lot of people have come to the conclusion that we can turn this around pretty quickly. We need to pay teachers what they're worth. The best teachers are incredibly valuable. We need to pay them what they're worth. Particularly specialists such as math specialists. We need to have merit-based pay. We don't. There's really very little incentive within the system for teachers. We have teacher tenure. Sensible tenure reform would do a lot based on studies that have been done. And there's got to be a mindset of innovation. You know, before the lockdown, there was hardly any use of modern technology within classrooms. Marshall Tuck ran for state school superintendent in 2018. He took over 6 failing schools in Los Angeles. And within 3 years, graduation rates had gone from 12% to 60%. College readiness had gone from literally 0 up to 50%. He made an enormous difference in people's lives. He narrowly lost the state school superintendent race in 2018, but the evidence is there that we can make these kinds of changes. Jim, I'm gonna wind up here, and all of this sort of points to, you know, the statistics and evidence I've showed you point to saying there's common sense reforms we can implement within state and local government. They're not partisan really in any way. Accountability, efficiency, getting things done on time, doing a good job. These aren't partisan issues. We've got to go back to sort of the mindset and the culture of Pat Brown. And if we can do that, we can produce lower cost housing, better schools. We can make much better use of a state budget that's 7.5 times higher than back in the day. And we can create a lot more dreams for the kids of California.